Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we have a drawing of a lake with some trees and mountains. This landscape is going to be done in graphite pencil. This is the paper I'm going to be working on. It's been primed with clear gesso. I wanted to have a little bit more tooth. I used Winsor & Newton clear gesso. The paper is a Fabriano drawing paper, 9 × 12 inches in size. And these are my pencils, the Faber Castell 9000 series graphite pencils. Now for the initial sketch, I'm not going to bother working out the entire composition. I'm just going to start with the mountains here at the top, because that's all I need to do for now. So I'm going to draw their shape, and then I'm going to shade the sky. You can hear that rough sound, scratchy sound. That's because of the clear gesso that I applied to the paper. So in case you don't know, clear gesso is a primer that creates a textured surface, kind of like sanded paper. And it's very good with pastel and colored pencil, but I sometimes like to use it with graphite as well. So first I applied a little bit of an HB graphite pencil, and then I started blending that with a brush. I want this to be very smooth. I don't need any texture or detail in there. So I'm just going to blend it until it looks fairly even. And I'm using a soft synthetic brush. I actually tried blending with a paper towel, which is what I would normally use on regular paper, but the surface was a little bit too rough. So the brush worked better. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the first mountain peak in the distance, and I'm still using an HB, which is the lightest pencil I have in this set. This is a 6-piece set that I have. And like I said, I'm using these conventional Faber Castell graphite pencils. And the reason why I'm still using the HB, which I used for the sky, is because I want this mountain peak in the distance to be very light. So it's going to be just a little bit darker than the sky, and I'm going to make it darker simply by applying a little bit more of the pencil, putting down a little bit more of the material. That's all I'm going to do. For the objects in front of that one, I'm probably going to switch to darker pencils. Now I'm blending that with a brush, and here I'm using a brush with a slightly narrower, smaller tip, so that I can have a clean edge, because I need a clean edge between the top of the mountain, the edge of the mountain, and the sky. I need to make it very clear where that object ends and the background begins, and I want to have a nice contrast. And you can see that I was able to create a contrast in value even though I used the same grade of the pencil. I simply used a little bit more of it, and maybe used a little bit more pressure, and maybe I'm going to use a little bit more pressure when blending as well. So that's going to do the trick. And I know that this mountain peak here now looks very dark, but it's going to look very light once I start stacking darker and darker elements in front of it. Now I'm going to use a kneaded eraser. So this is going to lift up a little bit of that material and create some smaller details of lighter value. Now I have to tell you, this clear gesso as a surface is great for textures, for blending and things like that, but for erasing not so much, because it gets kind of difficult to lift up the material, especially graphite, because graphite is a lubricant and kind of starts to stick to this surface and can be a little bit tricky. But I can still do a little bit of erasing as long as I don't really need to create very small, very sharp details with very clean edges and a lot of contrast. So I can just add these lighter details to try to suggest to the viewer that these are some of the lighter parts of the mountain covered with some snow. And just a few suggestions of that should do the trick. I'm doing the same thing here on the right side, where I drew another mountain peak, or another one of those hills, whatever they are. And I'm just gonna move on to the middle part of the scene now, and here I'm gonna have to do a little bit more sketching, where I'm first gonna draw the shape of this line of trees, or actually there are several lines of trees. By the way, in case you want to study, the reference is going to be in the description if you want to check it out. So I'm also drawing the outline of the lake, trying to work out its position and shape. And now I'm going to shade this mountain in the middle. Another thing that I have to tell you about is that when you use this protective tape on the borders, it doesn't really stick to the surface quite as well as it does to regular smooth paper. I don't know why that's the case, but that's just the way it is. So sometimes I need to be careful when I work around the edges. Anyway, now I'm using a 2B. I'm using a 2B pencil, which is a little bit darker, because I want this mountain peak here in the middle to be quite a bit darker than the ones in the background. So I'm going to lay down the shading very carefully so that I don't get an ugly texture. It can be blended pretty nicely. I can move that material easily, but still, you know, I don't want to risk creating very dark lines that I can't really move or blend in easily. So once I laid that down gently, I'm going to start blending. And you can see that it's already starting to get quite a bit darker than the objects in the background. What this does, it allows us to imitate that feeling of depth and distance. So it allows us to imitate the atmospheric effect by suggesting to the viewer that these darker elements are in front of the lighter ones, which are further in the back, which are kind of fading into the distance. Here I'm doing the same thing, using erasers to add some lighter touches, lighter details. I'm using a combination of this pencil eraser, and this is a Kohinoor pencil eraser, and I also use Faber Castell kneaded eraser every now and then. But I'm just going to do a lot of blending now, because I want this to be pretty smooth as well. Because on this mountain I also don't need texture or detail. Maybe a few suggestions of distant shapes or things like that, but nothing fancy, because these are all a part of the background, so I don't really want to have too much detail or too much textures that would be distracting in relation to all the elements that I'm going to put in front of them. So that's the upper part of the scene, that's my background. Now I'm going to move on to the midground, where I'm going to have lots of trees. I'm going to have a couple of these slopes which are covered with a lot of coniferous trees. And under those slopes, under those mountains, there's going to be a lake. But first I need to work out the exact shape of that slope. And then I need to work out where I'm going to place these trees and how large and how tall they're going to be. My approach to drawing these trees is very simple. I just draw a vertical line, and then I draw some... the vertical line, I use that to determine the position and the overall size and the height of the tree, and then I use the horizontal shapes and horizontal lines to imitate the shape of the canopy of a coniferous tree. And you can see that I'm getting these tapering shapes that kind of look like coniferous trees, evergreen trees. And I want to make them a little bit taller here on the left side. And I want to do a little bit of blending with a tortilla, because again I can't leave that much texture, because you see, texture, what texture is, it's an illusion of detail, and the more rough and the more detailed the texture is, the more the viewer's eye is attracted to that texture, and the more distracting it is. So when you're drawing something that is further in the distance, you might want to soften it a little bit with your blending tools so that it doesn't have too much of a texture. That's a trick that I use to create that feeling of distance and to draw the attention of the viewer to those elements which I want, basically. Here I try to make a row of trees that is a little bit darker than the one in the back. So I'm trying to create even more depth, or layers of trees. Not sure if that is working, but I can always soften that and blend that if I don't like the way it looks. But you can see that I covered these slopes with some trees, and now I'm going to work around the outline of this lake, adding a little bit of shadow, and then I'm going to shade the ground around it, because there's another interesting slope to the left, and that's the thing that I'm going to have to shade next once I finish the shape of this lake. The lake is going to be the central part of this drawing, I think, because that's where we're going to get the largest amount of contrast, because I'm going to be stacking darker elements in front of the lake. But we'll see how that goes. Right now I'm just shading this slope to the left, and what I want to do here is I want to create a texture that follows the shape of that slope, that follows the slope of that terrain. Because even when I start blending it, some of that texture and some of those lines will still remain. So I want to have those tiny shapes, tiny textures that indicate to the viewer what the angle of that slope, what the angle of that terrain is. The part of the scene that took a little bit more work was the trees. That took a little bit more time. Now I'm going to get into drawing some even more detailed elements. One of the things that I like to do is just stack foreground elements, just like this one, in front of all the background elements, and that creates a foreground interest, and it also creates a feeling of depth. Because when you put a large tall tree like I'm doing now here in the foreground, what that does, it kind of pushes all the other elements back, creating that feeling of depth. So I'm going to have a very tall tree here that is obviously very close to our point of view, and I'm also starting to use darker and darker grades for this, because I'm going to use 4B for the canopy, for those clusters of needles, and I used a 6B, I think, for the tree trunk. And I'm going to use an even darker pencil a little bit later, once I start adding some shadow areas on the tree trunk and in between those clusters of needles. So I say clusters of needles because that's what they are, because these are coniferous trees. I don't really know which exact type of a tree it is. I'm just going to try to create similar shapes that I see in the reference. They don't have to be exactly the same, but as long as the shape roughly resembles a coniferous tree, I'm pretty happy with it. So far I'm getting a very nice texture and some very nice detail, some very nice looking clusters. And now I'm going to use an even darker pencil to put some shadow on the tree trunk just under those clusters, because those parts of the tree trunk are going to be a little bit darker, and that's going to make the tree appear even more three-dimensional. And I'm going to add a little bit of shadow under those clusters as well, just so that I would indicate to the viewer that those are the shadow areas, because the light is coming from above. So whichever part of that cluster, whichever part of that surface is facing down or facing away from the light source, that's going to be a little bit darker. This takes a little bit of practice, just to create shapes that are kind of similar to an actual looking tree. But my trees don't look perfect. They just look, I suppose, close enough to the original, or natural enough so that they can pass for a realistic looking tree. I'm just refining some of the details and putting in some of those darker shadow areas. I'm going to put a few more trees, by the way, in the foreground. But now I want to add a little bit of value to this surface of the lake, because I can't leave it completely white. And I also want it fairly smooth, because I want to suggest to the viewer that this is the surface of the water. So I'm dragging my pencil vertically, creating some suggestions of reflections. And after that I'm going to use a pencil to create even more defined reflections of some of these trees. And they don't have to be perfect, you just have to try to roughly match the position of some of these taller ones, so that the shapes you're drawing kind of look like reflections in the water. And of course I can't leave them like this. I'm going to soften them a little bit with a brush, because if I don't soften them, they're going to have too much texture and they're not really going to look like they're a part of that reflective surface of the water. So this way, once I pull the pencil down and smear it a little bit, they look a little bit more like actual reflections. I can also refine that a little bit with a tortillon. So using a combination of a tortillon and a brush, I get some nice looking reflections, and that already I think looks like a nice little lake. And now I'm going to draw a few more trees. I'm going to draw another tall tree here next to this one on the left. Maybe this one will be a little bit smaller, a little bit thinner, not necessarily because it is actually smaller, but because it is a little bit further away from this one. A little bit further away from our point of view. I'm going to create a similar shape, maybe with a few of these bare branches here and there. I'm going to start with the top, adding some of these horizontal shapes on the side to suggest these are some of these clusters of leaves or clusters of needles which are forming around the branches, and creating larger and larger shapes and longer branches as I go down the length of the tree trunk, because that's the way they look. Most of these coniferous trees, they kind of have a conical shape, more or less. Well, a lot of them do anyway, not all of them obviously. I'm going to draw a few smaller ones here, just under these, because maybe these are a little bit further away, maybe they're a little bit younger, a little bit smaller. Doesn't really matter. Just want to have a few smaller shapes down here in front of the lake, just so that I could create a little bit more contrast with the lake, because that empty surface of the lake is not particularly interesting, but it is a good background for some of these darker shapes, so that I could create contrast and tension to capture the attention of the viewer, and also to better define those darker shapes which stand against the lighter background. Anyway, so there's a smaller fir tree or whatever it is, and then I'm going to draw another one here which is even smaller, so you can imagine that it's a little bit further away, further down that slope which is going down and away from our viewpoint. And then I'm going to draw a few more taller trees here on the right to frame the scene and to make it a bit more balanced. I'm going to go with similar shapes, but not exactly the same, obviously. You want to have a little bit of randomness and a bit of variation with trees, because trees come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So you have another one of those thin, tall trees here. Here I have to use a darker pencil because this part of the tree trunk won't stand out against the background, which is already pretty dark. We have those trees in the back. So I want the shape of the tree to stand out against them as well. So I need to make both the tree trunk and these parts of the canopy a little bit darker. So I'm going to work with some slightly darker pencils right away, rather than adding shadow areas later. So that's the tree. Again, I'm going to throw in a few of these bare branches, smaller branches in between those clusters of needles, just to make things a bit more interesting. And then I'm going to add a few tree stumps or broken trees here at the bottom. So if you look at the reference, I saw that there was some broken trees on the left, but I thought that that was not a great position for them because the shapes didn't really stand out that well against the other trees. So I thought maybe I should throw in a few of those broken tree trunks here on the right side where their shapes will be a little bit easier to see, easier to discern against that lighter background of the lake. So I call it a rearrangement of the elements. Also, those were vertical. I made one of mine horizontal, kind of laying on the ground. So I thought that this was a good decision because now we have some interesting shapes that stand out against that lighter surface of the lake. Now I need to do the foreground. I'm not going to make it too detailed. I'm just going around some of these shapes, creating some of these shapes where I'm going to try to create a little bit of variation in the terrain. I'm going to make it look like some of these are a little bit darker than the others, so that some of the ones whose outline I already drew will stand out. So I'm going to work around them by laying down a little bit more value, and I'm going to work in such a way so that I create a texture that kind of looks like maybe grass, bushes, a combination of some dirt and stones and things like that. So basically I'm just going to drag my pencil and play around with it and see what kind of shapes I can come up with. But it's not going to be specific shapes really, it's mostly going to be suggestions of shapes or suggestions of details by using a rough texture that this surface of the paper provides me with. Because one of the advantages of clear gesso, that I already explained that I like to use that with pastel and with colored pencils, but it's actually an interesting surface to work on when you're working in graphite. It creates a very rough, toothy surface, and it makes it very easy to create this illusion of detail. And another advantage it has, it's actually not reflective. Normally when you use graphite on regular paper, you get graphite shine. On this surface you don't really get graphite shine. It's kind of like charcoal, except for the fact that it blends better than charcoal. So in many ways working with graphite pencil on clear gesso is even better than working with charcoal. But I think it doesn't really erase quite as well, which is why I can't really draw some of these smaller, finer details in the foreground, because I would just get a lot of muddying and I don't think it would work. So on this surface erasing is not that great, but you know, for illusion of detail, for these textures and for darker tones, for creating nice contrast like this scene has, this surface works really great, maybe even better than charcoal in some ways. And you can see what dark tones I'm able to create. Here I created a small suggestion of path going down the middle of that foreground area, and maybe some rocks and grass on the sides. I wasn't really happy with the scene because I felt that it needed even more trees in the foreground, so I decided to throw in another one. The reason why I wanted to throw in another tree here is because I felt that the whole mountains in the back were kind of simple and I didn't really know how to make them more interesting. So I decided to throw in another tree in front of them, creating more contrast and tension and obscuring a little bit more of the mountain. And that, I think, worked, because the scene got even more interesting and I think even more balanced. So I'm just going to keep working on these canopies. As you can see, I'm just adding some random details and branches and clusters of needles. I just want to have, I want to make the canopies of the trees look a little more random and a little bit more thick. Like there's lots of stuff in there, lots of branches, lots of needles. And this rough texture of the paper is really helping me with this, I think. But I just want to have a lot of these lines, lots of details. But I also want to work on their shape, the outer shape, so that it doesn't look too ugly or unnatural. So once I finish that, I think the scene will be more or less complete. Just a little bit more work on the trees. I'm pretty much done with the drawing now. I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower left corner. And I hope you like the way the scene was constructed. Don't forget to check out my other videos and maybe give me a comment and like the video so that you can help out my channel. And of course, if you want to see more content and longer videos, you should see my Patreon. Thanks for watching.